Hi, my name is Quinn Malone. Thank you for coming to my presentation. The FITS task is a task that involves pointing at targets of a certain size and a certain distance away from a starting position. The time it takes to move to the target, or movement time, is predicted by the size and distance to the target one is pointing to. The evidence shows that measurements from a FITS task can discriminate between people with and without movement affective disorders. Therefore, it might be useful as a rehab progress tracking tool, a diagnostic tool, or a screening tool. However, we need to have smaller and cheaper equipment to measure the FITS task to enable adoption in clinical and other restrictive environments. I developed a portable and relatively inexpensive system to measure a FITS task using an accelerometer and a touchscreen that automatically analyzes and reduces data. The objective of the study was to validate the system I developed against previously used equipment. Ideally, the measurements from the system would be compared to the gold standard, the 3D Investigator Motion Analysis System, but this was not doable because of restrictions arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead, what I did was I compared the results of my accelerometer to the results of my touchscreen. And as touch has been used many times before to measure the FITS task, it can be considered a standard of measurement, even if it isn't necessarily the gold standard of measurement. I also wanted to try and make comparisons between my equipment and the gold standard equipment. And the best way to do that was to replicate a study that had used the gold standard equipment. One study that had done this was Glazebrook et al.'s report from 2015. Glazebrook et al. Considered a violation of FITS law, which happened when you have closely spaced target placeholders, where any one of them could be filled in as the objective target for that trial. When those placeholders are displayed before and during movement, movement time to the final target in an array is shorter than it should be. Therefore, two objectives resulted from this study. The first was to validate the system as a way to measure the FITS task, and the second was to see if I could replicate the results of Glazebrook et al. My hypotheses were, one, that my new method, the acceleration-based measurements, would produce similar results as previously used methods, so that would be Glazebrook et al.'s results and the results from my touchscreen. I also hypothesized that the results of Glazebrook et al. Would be replicated. The apparatus consisted of two main parts: the host computer, which displays targets and reduces data, and the glove, which served as the mounting for the accelerometer and the microcontroller. I delivered equipment to participants for them to set up and test themselves. I then oversaw them via video chat. As for the procedure, there were 5 targets divided into 3 blocks or target arrays, and you can see those on screen right now. For the target procedure, participants would start with their index finger on the home position. On touching the home position, target placeholders would appear. After a short for period, one of the target placeholders filled in and became the objective target for that trial. Participants were then to move as quickly and accurately as possible to touch the objective target with their right index finger. As for our outcome measures and statistical models, for our measurement methods, we had 2 of them, our acceleration method and our touch method. Movement onset and offset were determined independently with touch and acceleration, resulting in different measures of movement time from each method for each trial. As for our statistical models, we had both within and between method models. For our within method models, we used a 2-way 3-block by 3 relative position repeated measures ANOVA, and we used some t-tests that compared target 3 when it appears in the middle array position of the array to target 3 when it appears in the far position of the array. As for our between method models, we used 2 linear regressions. The first was comparing movement onset from touch to movement onset from acceleration, and the second was comparing movement offset from touch to movement offset from acceleration. As for our results, we ended up recruiting 22 people. For our ANOVA for movement time from our acceleration data, we saw a significant effect for block and for relative position, and we saw from the post hocs that block 1 had a shorter movement time than blocks 2 or 3. The nearest target was also shorter than the middle target, which showed a shorter movement time than the farthest target. Notably, movement time to the middle position is significantly shorter than to the farthest position. As for our ANOVAs for movement time from our touch data, we saw a significant effect for block and for relative position. Movement time to block 3 was found to be significantly longer than movement time to blocks 1 or 2 in our post hoc tests, and movement time to the nearest target was shown to be significantly shorter than to the middle or farthest targets. Notably, movement time to the middle and farthest targets was not significantly different. As for our t-test, which compared movement time to target 3 in the middle and farthest array positions, the middle array position resulted in a significantly longer movement time to target 3 in the farthest array position for both acceleration and touch. As for our linear regressions, for movement onset and offset, we saw significant correlations between our measurements. Moving on to the discussion, Our first objective was to examine the validity and feasibility of the new system. We saw very similar outcomes between the present study and Glazebrook et al. Our comparisons between our touch and acceleration outcomes show extremely well correlated movement onset and offset values. Because of the consistency of our results with Glazebrook et al. And the strong correlations between the touch method and the acceleration method should be seen as validated. Our second objective was to see if we could find the violation of Fitt's law that Glazebrook et al. Also found. Our results broadly conclude the same things as Glazebrook et al. From 2015. Our critical tests on movement time showed evidence of a violation. Now, there was a weaker effect than what has been reported. The post hocs on the acceleration movement time data showed a significantly longer movement time to the final target than to the nearer target. This is likely because the acceleration method was missing some lagging secondary submovements, and the algorithm for that method needs a bit of refining. Before I conclude, I'd like to briefly discuss a new hypothesis concerning the violation of Fitt's law that was observed in this experiment. The currently accepted explanation is that a gestalt, which is a whole made of separate parts, is created in the mind of the performer when they see the target array. The performer is able to process the edges of the gestalt more efficiently than the middle, resulting in faster movements to the near and far targets. Instead, what I think might be happening is that participants are being more careful when reaching to the middle target, as they feel the need to avoid the target placeholders on either side of it, whereas when reaching to the near and far targets, they don't feel a strong need to avoid the void on one side. This placeholder avoidance hypothesis predicts a few things. First, if you have an outlined target range in which targets could appear, basically if you make the gestalt real, you should see the violation disappear. Second, populations that do not construct gestalts to the same degree, for instance, people with autism, should produce the same results as an asymptomatic population when given the experiment that we conducted here. Lastly, movement time to the middle targets should more closely adhere to Fitt's law than when no target borders are present. This is because the width factor of Fitt's law only contributes when some consequence exists for inaccuracy. Placeholders, I think, create a perception of consequence, and so people will adhere more to the width prediction of Fitt's law when performing a violation task. To conclude, we had two objectives going into this experiment. The first was to see if a novel accelerometer device and custom software could feasibly and validly measure a Fitt's task performance. Our touch and acceleration methods resulted in similar outcomes to each other. They were highly correlated, and we found similar results to Glazebrook et al. 2015. And so this objective was achieved. Our second objective was to replicate the results of Glazebrook et al. 2015. We found the same violation as they found, and we found a similar pattern of results. And so this objective was also achieved. Thanks for coming to this presentation.